Yeah, I really did. I know we touched on this a little bit, just about the direction that things are headed. What is the next step, you feel, and what can we be doing to pick up the to carry the torch, to pick up the ball and run with it?
Well, I feel the next step is for the district attorneys to investigate their diocese, to get the list of everyone who's made reports to law enforcement and the survivor advocates groups, and truly investigate those lists of names.
Do you feel that there is a sort of hesitancy on the part of the local judiciary to investigate this?
My sense is that our legal system requires that we be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, meaning that there's 99.9% probability, not even probability, like a jury.
There has to be irrefutable
evidence, and it can't be something where a juror would have to reason the answer, right? And so I feel that part of the problem is because most of these instances happen behind closed doors, right? Witnesses aren't in the room when it's happening.
He said, she said.
It comes down to he said, she said, and then experts are looking at the behaviors of the child and what the child is reporting, what adults were around at the time that could testify to the behavior of the child, and
reputation of others involved.
right.
Yeah.
And I mean, I would just say, speaking for myself, as a therapist, I'm very much not a children's therapist, and very much for a reason. I have nothing but respect for people who take that on, because kids are so slippery. Trying to understand their mental state, trying to help them develop a framework and a lexicon for how to talk about these types of experiences is incredibly tricky. And I applaud our system of government. I think it's an important value that we have, that people are innocent until proven guilty. But in these circumstances, anything said by a kid comes with a reasonable doubt attached to it. And so these are really tricky things to prosecute.
Right, and so I think, to your point, it's really important for adults to be trained to recognize the red flags of child sexual abuse, and for the people who are taking reports from children or from their loved ones to be trained in trauma-informed interviews and be trained in how to recognize the red flags, right? So when you have, so say you know a child, I'll just make it up, in your school, and one day they're happy, they're involved, they want to come and hang out with you at football practice, you name it, and then the next day they want nothing to do with the coach. They are depressed. They start
Acting out.
So there are all these symptoms that we know are characteristics of some trauma having happened to that child, and it's every adult's responsibility. It's even part of the Texas Penal Code that any person in the state of Texas who suspects any type of child abuse must report it. So there's a gap between clergy holding themselves above the law and what the penal code says. And so that's a gap that needs to be closed.
And those in the congregation feeling like if you are in an emergency situation, usually they say you need to point to a specific person and tell them to call 911. Don't say somebody call 911, because then no one will call 911.
That diffused responsibility.
Right. And in the same vein, saying the congregation of, well, somebody else, I'm sure, is looking into this. I'm sure somebody else has noticed this. Well, just because somebody else has noticed it doesn't mean they're doing jack shit about it.
Right. So from my own personal survivor story, I was a little girl when I was abused, and it was by the Lutheran youth minister. And he took me on a camping trip with other adults. When he took me away from the campsite, the adults who were there didn't respond appropriately.
Right.
The next morning when I came running through the camp to go back to the car, the adults didn't respond appropriately. As a teenager, when I made an outcry to my family didn't respond appropriately. So the issue is not a children's issue. The issue is an adult issue. And adults responding appropriately when they see something, right? So to put the onus on a child to go talk and make a report to law enforcement is ludicrous.
Yeah, absolutely.
I can even say from my own personal experience, not related to abuse by a clergy member, but abuse by a neighbor, I noticed things were not, as a child, I noticed things were not right. And I said something to, related to a neighbor who was just a little bit older than me and her stepfathers, yada, yada, yada. And I said something to my parents, to which the response was, well, that's just not, there's no point in saying something if it's not a problem. Like, we don't want to say something and cause a stir if nothing's actually going on.
Right.
Let's look at the evidence here and look at the data and say, okay, statistically, likelihoods, yeah, let's hop on this and make sure the kid is okay rather than just sweeping it under the rug.
Well, and statistically, they victimize more than one person. So in the case of my perpetrator, he was formally removed from the roster 10 years after my abuse. And there were other people in the community that he was victimizing.
And that's one of the really terrifying things for me when we look at, just in Texas, just the people that the Archdiocese declared to be credibly accused. We're already talking about 286 people. So even at 10 victims each, which to me feels very conservative, and we should recognize that credibly accused does not mean guilty, but it does. It is very incredibly concerning, yeah. But even at 10, we're talking about 3,000 victims here in Texas alone. And as you said, SNAP is a global organization. This is a global issue, and that's just specifically talking about the church.
Right.
And so I guess to your point earlier about changes in the culture, I like that we're having these conversations. It feels incredibly depressing, but I wonder if
necessary.
And I wonder if anybody was having these conversations 20 years ago in the way that we are now.
Looking at how things went, I remember when the whole thing first came out. I was young when it all first came out by the the Spotlight Report, and that was just, how should I put it? Not surprising, even at my age, not surprising, but at the same time, just jaw-dropping. Because it's happening, but the sheer magnitude is so soul-crushing, if I can use that term. So yeah, I think it's a very important issue for us to talk about and to continue to press on. I know we've talked about it before, and we're talking about it again, and we will talk about it again in the future until something changes.
Well, and to that point, I think it's important to stress the reason that we talk about it is to do something about it. And one thing that we're doing just by having the conversation is to raise awareness, to raise, I guess, a certain level of comfort with having these discussions, to normalize these experiences a little bit. And I think that's incredibly valuable. But there needs to be more than that. So that being said, what kinds of programs does SNAP offer, and what can we be doing? I know we talked about what the next step ought to be from like a government level, but for our viewers and, honestly, for our largely atheist audience who's not a part of the church, what's our responsibility in protecting children?
And what can the individual person do to help?
Right. Well, one thing that everyone can do, they can go to the website. It's www.d2l.org. It's Darkness to Light. And they have online training. And this is also the same organization that our Texas educators have to take for their classes. And everyone can be trained on how to recognize red flags, how to be an upstander, be an active bystander, and how to report.
And you also have a hotline, do you not, for anyone who has been victimized?
SNAP has a hotline. It's manned like Monday through Friday. There's a National Sexual Assault hotline. It's 1-800-656-HOPE. And that's the RAIN National Hotline, and they are 7/24. So they can report or call that number for support, and they will talk them through how to report if that's the decision that if they're ready to do that. SNAP highly encourages people to make a report to law enforcement because we see so many cases where there's almost always more than one victim.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Even if your experience isn't necessarily prosecutable, there's still a responsibility to report in order to just shed light on a situation.
Right.
And possibly uncover other abuses toward other people.
Right. There's a SNAP supporter in Houston, Mike Norris. The church felt his accusation was not credible, and he filed a lawsuit, a civil suit. And when his civil suit was publicized, another victim came forward. And so together, the two of them were able to make a civil suit against him. Yep.
That is very good. And I do see that we do have on the screen d2l.org. And is that...
That's the website.
That's the website for SNAP.
That's the website for the training.
For the training, sorry. Please go and get the training. I'm going to do that this week because the worst thing I can imagine is seeing something, not recognizing it, and not saying anything. So, with that, would you guys like to get to another call?
Yeah.